Before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement to note that we're on the traditional and ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam people here where we're delivering this talk today. And as we know, when we do a land acknowledgement, it's not enough about just saying that and moving on. But I think the key for us, especially in IRES, as we deal with issues of critical importance around resources, environment, and sustainability, is to really ask ourselves, how does what we're researching, even if it might not directly deal with questions facing Indigenous peoples, how does what we're addressing link to broader questions around settler colonialism or injustice more generally, or relationship to territory? So if you're doing something like subsidies for electric energy efficiency, how does that link to ideas around land ownership, for instance? So we have to think very fundamentally. So for Vincent's talk today, just thinking about the broader systems of colonial water governance, even though that's not directly what he'll be speaking to, but how does that intersect with these concerns and issues? So I'm very happy today to introduce to you Vincent Chireh, who's a PhD candidate in our program. He's working with myself and also Jordy Honey Roses. So he came to us first after doing a master's degree at Memorial University, where he looked at water issues, especially facing rural communities and Indigenous communities out east. Prior to that, he comes to us having done his BA at the University of Ghana-Legon. He has a number of publications dealing with questions of climate change adaptation, looking at questions, for instance, such as the role of community radio in outreach and knowledge mobilization, and other key issues. And today he'll be giving us a segment of his dissertation work. Vincent Chireh, thank you.
Thank you very much, Leila, for the kind and wonderful introduction. And thank you everyone for being here and giving me the opportunity to be able to share part of my PhD research. I have been exploring aspects of water demand management and conservation practices, including the challenges and the progress, prospects, and as well as the equity implications of these management strategies in terms of water access and affordability. And I want to add to Leila's point that we need to acknowledge that on the land we sit on, and the land is the Musqueam people's land. As part of today's presentation, I will give a brief background and overview of the research that I've been doing here, including the overarching questions and scope that I frame my questions and the methodology used in the Is it okay now? Okay. Is it okay now? Okay, thank you. So as I said, I'll give a brief background and overview of my research, including the overarching questions, the scope that I work within, and the methodologies that I use. And for today, I will focus on the rising interest in water demand management and conservation efforts in British Columbia. And here I will indicate why we need to regulate water demand, the adoption progress of demand management measures and practices, and the implications of such measures on water pricing and equity concerns. And I will end with a key takeaways of the presentation. First of all, what do we mean when we talk about water demand management or conservation in total? These are a mix of programs and policies in the form of education, technology, and pricing reforms, laws and regulations that are often used by utilities and governments to regulate water use. And water demand management is actually intended to influence water use behaviors to be able to efficiently and effectively use water, to reduce water wasteful overuse, and also to enhance infrastructure such that we reduce water losses. Secondly, why must we even regulate or reduce water use in the second place? We know, climate change is fast happening and affecting almost everything, including water resources. And right here in BC, we have witnessed some of the record-breaking high temperatures in recent times, that have been causing heat waves, floods, been causing rainstorms and wildfires as well, with the associated impact on water resources, including increase in water demand for cooling purposes, and also pollution and reduction of water, freshwater supplies. Urban growth as well is happening right here in BC, and this comes with additional demand for water, coupled with the competing demand for water from the agriculture sector as well as the industrial sector. So these high demands are sending signals to water managers to maintain a resilient water system through conservation. Additionally, municipalities are facing financial and human capital or human resource challenges in building new infrastructure or upgrading the old ones to be able to manage current demand. An increase in water demand also means that an increase in wastewater production and the impact of that on the treatment cost as well as to the environment. Aside from these overarching reasons, utilities and governments normally implement these demand management measures in order to recover water costs or regulate, in order to recover water costs or generate revenues to enhance water systems efficiency or to ensure that water is distributed and built fairly or equally. These measures and practices there are many, and they have been grouped under 4 categories, including regulations and laws, as we have often seen in BC here during summer periods where they kind of place some kind of restrictions on outdoor water use, and then financial incentives and disincentives in terms of tax credits or rebates for fines and penalties, and also technological advances as well as educational campaigns. This classification, however, is not mutually exclusive because some of these tools or measures are complementary when it comes to the implementation. And these policies are often done by utilities either through using various instruments, either through mandatory hookups, either through voluntary sign-ups or mandatory or regulatory conditions, or a combination of any of them. Why should we be concerned about water demand management and equity, particularly in BC here? Yes, a couple of things that British Columbians should be concerned about. Firstly, British Columbia has been one of Canada's highest water use per capita per day, and that is, we use about 472 liters of water per person per day. And this is way beyond the WHO recommended 50 to 100 liters of water per day for everybody. However, there has been a gradual reduction in the past years, according to Statistics Canada. There's also a growing interest in BC and investment by local governments to implement and adopt some of these water demand management measures, especially residential water metering in response to climate change and as well as budget deficits that they are running into. However, since 2016, there was a survey conducted by BC Municipal Water Survey by the Water Planning Lab. Since 2016 till now, there hasn't been any, nobody knows how the progress of these things have been and what the impact has been on water access and affordability as well. Out there, extensive literature has been successfully defined and even described, and in some cases, estimated the extent to which these policies affect water consumption. It influences revenue generation as well as fair distribution and pricing. However, to my knowledge, little research has explored the impacts of these measures on equitable water. And when I say equitable water, I mean water access and affordability, particularly for vulnerable populations. These were some of the issues that caught my attention and interest to contribute to this discourse, especially at the time when equity, inclusion, and redress for systemic marginality have become germane topics in environmental governance, yet there have been little research on those things. In contributing to filling this gap, I examined 3 major research questions in my PhD dissertation. First, to explore how water demand management or water demand management and conservation affect water equity in the literature. And here I explore how the literature conceptualizes equity in the first place, and what kind of measures are undermining equity, and how do they address inequity issues. Lastly, the next question was to track the progress in BC, and that was in my second, for the second research question. And lastly, based on insights from these two issues, I explored how water managers in BC attend to equity issues, citing or taking residential metering as a case study in selected communities around the province. To give a brief background, and the red demarcation there shows BC map. In most parts of BC, local governments, particularly cities, municipalities, and municipalities and cities and villages get their water from regional districts. And these regional districts supply this water to the local, to cities. And from there, they also take decisions as to water distribution and pricing. I administered questionnaires and interviews of water managers in various districts. And in the surveys, 97 responses were complete, valid, and used in the analysis. The interviews were in 21 communities where water metering was being implemented. I used SPSS and NVivo for both interview data and surveys respectively. For the descriptive analysis, I used frequencies and charts to gain a broader overview of water conservation efforts in British Columbia. And right here we can see, this chart was intended to see how many municipalities or how many local governments have water efficiency plans and how many are actually implementing it. And we have 84% of them who have the plans, but 74% are implementing it. And this information can help us to estimate and understand the level of interest and effort towards water conservation. This chart also shows the various water demand management measures that are being implemented in the province. And over there, 56% of all jurisdictions implement water restrictions and institutional, commercial, and residential industrial metering. Across the province, this has to do with water billing and charging. There have been two types of water billing, and it is either the flat rate or the volumetric rate. And the flat rate has to do with those connections that do not have water meters. But those with water meters, people are able to measure how much water they should charge for actual consumption. And in the survey there, in the chart there, I wanted to see how many people actually defaulted or delayed in paying bills. And out there, it is seen that 46% of respondents indicated that 1 to 5% of residents who are using water under their connection actually delayed in paying bills. The next one is about whether there have been any assistive programs for municipalities and cities to be able to help people who are not able to pay for their water bills. And we have only 14.7% of them are actually having assistive programs to help people who cannot pay bills. To summarize this presentation, local jurisdictions are increasingly adopting water demand management and conservation in BC. Therefore, it is right to discuss and include equity concerns now, as it is happening elsewhere. There's also a strong correlation between having a plan and also implementing the plan. And we still know that some people are defaulting or delaying in paying bills, and those reasons have been explored further in my interviews. And also, the general framing of equity has always been like equality. It doesn't consider anything about income levels or the social or economic factors of people when billing water supply. And so it is about time we start to reframe this equity, particularly for water demand management and conservation, to be able to bring in participation, recognition for water needs, and the ability to pay in charging for domestic water resources. for domestic water use. I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody for listening to me and for my supervisors for the support and the IRES lab members. Thank you. Yeah.
For the figures you showed on some of the last slide, where you have like an N is like 72, is each of those like a different water district? So each of those like or 76, does each of those 76 people represent like the same upstream number of customers, or are they all representing sort of differently sized water districts?
The question was as to whether do you mean the 75 number?
Yeah, yeah. So the 76, is this like a population stated, or is this just stated by the number of respondents?
So the question was whether the N equals to 75 there is for population weighted or for water districts. This survey, as I mentioned, was for local government establishments. And so this 75 was for jurisdictions across. So you have villages, we have municipalities, and we have cities. And each person, each officer, or I said this survey was administered by an officer from each of the establishments. And so we have communities, people who are coming from communities, and then people who are coming from municipalities, and people who are coming from towns administer the questionnaire. So this 75 is for jurisdictions. Yes.
Do you have an idea of what it looks like in terms of like you think through the 1.3% on the last graph? Or do you have an idea of what it looks like in terms of like the number of people who are like in those under jurisdiction?
Okay, the question was like whether I've gone deeper to look at the differentials as to what kind of people are defaulting. Sorry, I could not do that because this survey was about the water managers. And so we have municipal mayors or chief administrative officers and engineers who administer the questionnaire. So I didn't go deeper into the other indicators. Yeah, and as Leila mentioned, I can do that in my interviews, which I have got a lot of data on that, but that would be for the case study areas where I've selected 21 areas where they are actually metering their water systems. This one was just a cross on board survey that kind of asked a question about whether people defaulted, whether they were metering or it was flat rate. Everybody responded to this question. Yep.
Just maybe outside of go. I'm curious, how many different Canada where water usage is over 400? Is there any granularity with Canada that you find from water, or for example, when you see the cascade of commentators or by neighborhood,
yes, the question was asked whether the high liters of water per person per day in Vancouver, that is 400, in British Columbia, that is 472. Is there any detailed data as to whether these particular groups of people are using more water or not? Yes, that data is there, and that has been one of our issues that we are exploring as to see what type of usage are they putting water into. Is it discretionary use or it is for non-discretionary use? And so you will have people who are wealthy people who have who are watering lawns or having pools and other things use more water than people somebody who has like 5-10 people in a household and using water just for basic need. Yeah. Yeah, Steve.
I was curious about that. Yeah, that number of you said that I'm just curious, like
how much more is that what is that to do than rest of Canada? Like, is that kind of above average for the rest of for Canada, or is it like way above average?
Thank you very much. Steve wanted to know if the high water consumption rate in BC, that is 472 liters per person per day, is above any of the other provinces or the Canadian average. Yes, I think a couple of other provinces like Newfoundland and Labrador, and then the Yukon, and I think Quebec, they have higher consumption rates more than BC. But BC is actually one of the highest, I think about the third or the fourth one, and it is way above the Canadian figure. That has just skipped my mind, but the Canadian figure is not up to the BC figure.
Like the recommended or the average?
The average Canadian, the recommended is the one that we are using, the WHO, the World Health Organization recommended standard, but in all over in BC, most places in BC are way above the 100 to 50. Yeah, I don't know whether I mentioned that, but I think the WHO recommended is 100 to 50 liters per person per day. But everyone else is almost using like 400. And I also need to indicate that this is just for overall water usage. We have that of residential use that is around 200 and around 200 liters per person per day for BC. So there's a difference between the overall water usage and residential use. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you, Jiang, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. So today I would like to share my research, which is on how framing influences preference for multiple solutions. So the premise of my research is that we often notice that the solutions to a lot of environmental and social problems are framed in an either or dichotomous fashion, if you will. So for example, when it comes to climate change, the solution is often framed in terms of either government actions such as environmental policies, carbon taxes, or individual actions like eating less meat or driving less. And another example is this conflict surrounding agriculture and biodiversity loss, where there are two contrasting proposals, which are land sharing, which is practicing wildlife-friendly agriculture across a large area, and also land sparing, which is limiting highly intensive agriculture to small areas of land and leaving the rest for nature and wildlife. This kind of dichotomous framing is everywhere, and it is partly driven by the tendency of dichotomous thinking. So dichotomous thinking is basically the tendency of humans to categorize things, people, and really all other stimuli into two contrasting and separate categories. And these examples can be found everywhere. So for example, we as individuals tend to categorize people into either friend or foe. Many countries have two dominant left and right political parties. And even as scientists, we use a significance threshold to determine whether our results are statistically significant or not. And this prevalence of dichotomous thinking is partially a testament to its usefulness, because it's actually very useful in facilitating information processing, because we need simplification and categorization to do so. But at the same time, it is also very counterproductive when we're trying to solve those aforementioned complex problems. And the reason is because this kind of dichotomous framing can cause us to think that two solutions are mutually exclusive. It has to be either for example, government or individual action, whereas in reality, it should be both and also include some other solutions, like even corporations should have some part to play in mitigating climate change. And this kind of dichotomous framing, by focusing on just either one of the solutions, can also lead to suboptimal outcomes. So there's really the need to develop a kind of framing to reduce dichotomous thinking and also promote a more multi-solution approach. The main knowledge gap here is that this kind of dichotomous thinking has mainly been studied as a personality trait, because dichotomous thinking is actually associated with certain mental disorders like borderline personality disorder or even depression. And it has not very often been seen as an intervention point in these complex social or environmental issues. With that said, we do know that in order to promote something, framing can be used, and specifically to reduce the psychological distance of a problem between the individual and the problem, to make it more relatable, in other words. And so, for example, some previous framing studies on climate change have emphasized, say, the local effects, local extreme weather events, or use public health frames like climate change leads to more faster spread of diseases, those to make the issue of climate change more relatable. And so how can we, knowing this, how can we make a multi-solution approach more relatable to people? Well, first, there's probably the multi-cause frame that we could use, which is to dissect a problem, to present multiple aspects of a problem and how those aspects each require probably a unique solution. There is also the multi-impact frame, which could talk about how a problem causes multiple impacts to different sectors of society. This mechanism could perhaps be a little different because it also increases concern and anxiety, which might also increase relatability. And finally, the most straightforward frame is the multi-solution frame, which is simply to tell people that multiple solutions are important, because a lot of people don't actually know this. Okay, so in this study, basically we designed a survey to test how participants had indicated their perceived preferred solution, perceived severity, and perceived urgency due to 8 important issues. And so the 2 hypotheses are that the participants under the free experimental frame I just mentioned will choose the multiple solution option or show higher preference for multiple solutions compared to the control condition. And the second hypothesis is that perceived severity and urgency will be higher for participants under the multi-impact condition. So this experiment, it was pre-registered on the Open Science Framework, and it was conducted on MTurk, which is an online platform where participants can be paid to complete surveys and other tasks. And it was designed in Qualtrics. We recruited about 1,400 participants, and this experiment was randomized between subjects designed with 4 conditions: the free experimental conditions and also a control condition. And we also did a power calculation to ensure that a minimum number of participants was met. So the procedure here is that for each participant, they were presented with 8 problems, these 8, climate change, crop yield, and so on, in a random order. And for each of these problems, they had to indicate the perceived severity of the problem, the perceived urgency, and also the perceived solution, which I'll talk about more in detail later. And after these 8 problems, they'll answer a dichotomous thinking inventory, which is a questionnaire that measures their degree of dichotomous thinking. And finally, there are also some demographic questions. So this is just to give you an idea of what the survey looks like. So the first paragraph, I'm using the climate change problem as an example. In the first paragraph, it's basically a brief overview of the problem. And then it is followed by several bullet points, which in this case lists multiple causes of this problem. And after that, there are the three questions that the participants must answer: the severity question, the urgency question, and also finally the preferred solution. Now, the first two of these choices are so-called binary options, which are the two sides of a dichotomy, like in this case, government and individual action. The third one is the multi-solution option, which is stated as multiple solutions are needed in addition to 1, 2. And for the final option is neither. This is the multi-impact condition. The difference is instead of listing multiple causes, it lists multiple impacts in the bullet points. And the same goes for the multi-solution condition, which lists multiple solutions in the bullet points. And the control condition simply presents the first paragraph without any additional information. So first I'll talk about the pre-register analyses. So the main measures, of course, are the preference for multiple solutions, which is calculated as the number of multiple solution options that each participant chose out of a possible 8. And then there's perceived severity and perceived urgency, which is calculated as the average severity or urgency rating for each participant across the 8 problems. And finally, there's dichotomous thinking, which is measured by the dichotomous thinking in the theory. So we did Kruskal's tests to see if there's any difference between the conditions, and no significant differences were found for any of these variables. But we did find some interesting patterns in our exploratory analysis, which are mostly correlations. So for example, we found that preference for multiple solutions was positively correlated with both perceived severity and urgency, and also negatively correlated with the degree of dichotomous thinking. And preference for multiple solutions was also negatively correlated with political orientation and education, which is to say that the more conservative or the more highly educated a person was, the less likely they were to prefer the multiple solution option. So what do these results show? So first of all, there's no significant difference in the main variables in this study, which means that neither of our hypotheses was supported. This might be because, and another interesting thing to note is that we analyzed the number of participants that chose each option for each problem under and also across the conditions. And actually, over half of the participants chose the multi-solution option in almost all problems and across all conditions. And this might be because in our study, we did not impose any kind of constraint like a monetary constraint or resource constraint. And so because multiple solutions sound better, so the participants automatically chose the multi-solution option. And another thing to note is that the participants in this study were actually highly educated. Over 70% had a bachelor's degree. So perhaps they were more educated on these issues and did not need framing to nudge them to choose the multi-solution option. So this is just an example. You can see that in climate change across all the conditions, over half the participants actually chose the multi-solution option. And also found that, well, participants with higher severity and urgency, as well as lower dichotomous thinking, showed higher preference. So this suggests that severity, urgency, and dichotomous thinking are better predictors of people's preference for multiple solutions than the framing that we used. And so how can future studies go forward? So future studies should probably focus on addressing this severity and urgency. Now, I have to be clear at this point is that I'm not advocating that we artificially inflate the severity and urgency of a problem, but instead we can approach it in terms of communicating the known risks of a problem to people, and through those people addressing those risks, they can increase their well-being. So this is something that has been done on in certain medical studies, like communicating the risks of a disease could help patients stick to their prescriptions more. So I'm advocating for something along these lines. And also because this kind of risk perception is often associated with anxiety, and anxiety, like climate anxiety, is also sometimes associated with higher willingness to engage in climate-related action. So this is also one direction that is future research should look into when promoting multi-solutions. And also, the last thing to note is that future interventions should also think about reducing dichotomous thinking. The current scope of dichotomous thinking research is, like I mentioned, limited because it's mostly limited to personality disorders or mental disorders. But then again, one way to reduce dichotomous thinking more generally is perhaps to improve emotional well-being. This has been done on certain research related to political polarization, which is often contains dichotomous tendencies. But ultimately, it's not an either-or situation. Reducing dichotomous thinking also requires broader systematic changes to sort of reduce the incentive of people to think dichotomously. And finally, so the more conservative or highly educated a participant was, the less likely they were to prefer the multiple solution option. This might be because many of the issues that featured in the study are considered liberal issues, so to say, so they're less likely to receive. Conservatives are less likely to think that they even need solutions to begin with. As for highly educated people, they might think that the multi-solution option is perhaps a little too vague, because if you can recall, the first two binary options had very specific examples, whereas the third option, the multi-solution option, was just multiple solutions are needed in addition to 1 and 2. So perhaps that could have put some people off. So in conclusion, the findings of this study suggest that future research should, in order to promote multiple solutions, future research should look into addressing people's concern for those issues, and also to reduce dichotomous thinking in general in society. Okay, thank you for my supervisors, and thank you everyone for listening. Okay, any questions? Yes. Yes, so for people on Zoom, the question was, how did I choose those 8 problems featured in the study? So this study was designed with an American audience in mind, because most of the participants on MTurk are American. So we basically chose the most pressing issues, current issues in the US. And particularly, I looked up the some surveys from Pew Research Center to know what people are most concerned about these days. Sorry?
So talk about
dichotomous thinking being linked to socialization. I'm wondering, has there been work on linking dichotomous thinking directly to kind of how climate-related policies are implemented? Or yeah, so like how kind of clear is and what is actually happening to us?
Mhm. So the question was, has there been any research linking dichotomous thinking to how climate policies are implemented? Yeah, I think this question should be answered in two. So the first half is I guess I should clarify. So when I talk about political polarization and dichotomous thinking, I'm mostly referring to the polarization between the left and right, and a person if they're either too left or too right, that's considered sort of dichotomous. And as for policy, the policy aspect, I haven't seen any particular research that talks about policy, but it's more, again, whether people support certain policies or not. So it kind of goes back to that left and right divide. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks so much for that. Wondering if you think the reason why you see such an effect is that you think that your intervention was sufficiently distinct among your group, and if so, how might you change the intervention or have some significant intervention so that you might be able to have that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the question was, how might I modify my experimental design to make the conditions sufficiently more different from each other? So the thing is, I didn't mention it in my talk, but I actually had a manipulation check. So one of the problems that I encountered very early on in this study is that notice that the participants weren't actually reading the information. Yeah. So to ensure that they did, I eventually implemented a manipulation check where participants, after reading the information the first time, they actually had to sort of order those bullet points in the correct order to proceed to the questions. I did that, and yeah, there was still no difference. So I think of course we can look into how framing might affect people. I think, as I mentioned in the discussion, we also need to look into other options too, because maybe framing does have a fairly limited effect on dichotomous thinking. Yes. So your question was how prevalent are those mental conditions or disorders related to dichotomous thinking, and how prevalent dichotomous thinking is in general? So in this study, I mean, there's no way to tell whether participants in this study had those mental or disorders or conditions. I would assume that it's a fairly low proportion. And as I mentioned before, in terms of dichotomous thinking, in this study at least, taking broader views, we're not trying not just focus, because those everybody has dichotomous thinking tendencies. It's just that certain mental disorders are especially associated with an excessive amount of dichotomous thinking. Okay, yeah, thank you everyone for listening, and thank you for your questions.